Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to another episode of Global Crisis, Global Solidarity, a bi-weekly discussion show hosted by the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung, streaming live from Berlin. The Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung is one of Germany's major political foundations promoting political education and research in the spirit of our namesake, iconic socialist leader, Rosa Luxemburg. We have offices in 25 countries around the world and see ourselves as a facilitator of interaction and exchange between the labor movement and left actors around the world. Every first and third Wednesday of the month, we welcome thinkers, activists, scholars, etc. to develop a better understanding of local, regional, and international political dynamics, and also take a serious look at what kinds of strategies an internationalist left could develop to confront the challenges facing us today. My name is Lauren Bellhorn, and joining me as always is Fida Al-Zanin. If you'd like to be part of today's conversation, go ahead and drop a question on the Facebook or YouTube live streams, and we'll do our best to bring them up with our guest. Today we're talking about the coronavirus, and specifically the coronavirus in the Indian state of Kerala. India is one of the countries hardest hit by the pandemic. Currently, there are total cases currently nearing 2 million and continuing to surge. But there has been one modest positive exception to the trend in that country, namely the southern state of Kerala, governed by the Left Democratic Front, an alliance of communist and socialist parties, which has kept infections relatively low and has one of the lowest mortality rates from the virus in the country. Under the slogan of physical distance, social unity, the left government mobilized civil society to participate in public health campaigns while also ensuring that the state's most vulnerable were not left behind during the lockdown and ensuing economic crisis. Today, we're speaking with Professor V.K. Ramachandram of the Government State Planning Board. Professor Ramachandram is also the editor of the Review of Agrarian Studies, a Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung project partner in the country. To learn more about the state's response, the role of socialist politics and socialist ideas in Kerala's politics, and how the state compares to the performance of the rest of the country under current Prime Minister Narendra Modi of the right-wing BJP party. Professor Ramachandram, thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
So we want to start out with asking...
pleasure to be with you, Lauren and Fida.
So we want to start out by asking you about the state or the situation in Kerala at the moment. So Kerala was actually the first Indian state to record coronavirus cases, registering them, the very first cases, at the end of January of this year. The state's response, namely the government freeing up hospital beds quickly, launching initiatives like the Break the Chain campaign, which was a popular hand-washing campaign around the state, has been hailed both in India and around the world as an exemplary approach to dealing with the virus, particularly in the developing world. How are things on the ground now, 4 or 5 months in, especially now with the pandemic spiking across the country? Has Kerala's success been sustainable?
Well, you're right. That we had early successes in early tracking. We were the first state to record a coronavirus case, a young woman who's studying in Wuhan. But you see, when we have had experience year before last with the Nipah virus, and the government here, the health authorities, when they saw the coronavirus early, when there was early news of the outbreak in Wuhan, the idea that a virus outbreak there will affect us here was we were very aware of that and took early steps. Today, because of the return we have reached a new stage in coronavirus cases. Because we have had, Kerala is an economy which sends a lot of workers to other parts of India and other parts of the world, particularly the countries of West Asia. And more than 700,000 have actually returned to the state. This began a process of an uptick in the caseload here. So we have now, of course, we are still continuing with our policies of, trace, isolate, treat. But it has certainly advanced. It had certainly advanced compared to a few months ago, when we had not only flattened, almost crushed the curve. But I think we're still this sort of solid advantages that Kerala has continues. Those advantages continue. I'm sure you'll want to talk about that. But so as a result, our case fatality rate is still about 0.3, 0.4. It's under 1. So it's much less than India. Fatality is much less than India. It's still in two digits. Today, my colleague just tells me it's 88, the number of cases today, the number of fatalities till today. So, and I think more than that, the awareness, the campaign, we'll go into those as you ask me more about policy, but those still remain advantages for Kerala. We have to be very, very, very vigilant though. And a lot of clustered areas in the state have been identified where the caseload is higher, where the spread is higher. And and special measures are being taken there to control the virus.
Thanks a lot, Professor Ramachandram. But we would like to know more about, or speaking of the policies implemented in Kerala, what was exactly done differently in Kerala, particularly compared to other Indian states? What was the strategy implemented in Kerala?
See, I think, can I get a bit, sort of take one step back, and we talk about in the work of the celebrated economist Amartya Sen. He uses this term, public action. Now, what are the components of public action? On the one hand, you have public action from above, the actions of state policies, laws, rules, regulations. On the other hand, you have public action from below. Public action from below means not only adversarial acts, which is important, but also acts of civic cooperation. Now, this model of public action has been sort of the mainstay of Kerala's policy. We have had a series of, we have had a history of development of education, public health, and institutions of local government. All of these were pressed into action right from the beginning. And this has not happened in other states. Don't have this kind of social infrastructure or this kind of network of local government institutions. So right in the beginning, I'm going to separate our response into two. One is our public health response, and that it's there for all to see. The attempt at early detection of tracing, treatment, and so on. We also had a great deal of success with our policies of quarantining, particularly what we call reverse quarantining. Kerala is one of the states in India, one of the few states where it's got a because of our demographic transition, we have a substantial population of people above the age of 60. So we have a vulnerable population in that respect. And so the quarantining of those who are susceptible to disease, that became a public movement. And so that's one, the public health side. On the other side, on the side of economic policy, see, we had a series of lockdowns, which we believe were necessary. But during a lockdown, so we have a very, during the lockdown, our first policy was a policy of providing for livelihoods and for people's welfare through a system of direct benefit transfers. This was very early done. So perhaps we can see it in four aspects of this. One, early policy was to make sure that nobody went hungry or without basic necessities. So our public distribution system of food was activated, and through the welfare boards of various sets of workers, different in the organized and unorganized sectors, we provided for basic expenditure, so basic necessities plus food. The second was to provide everybody with shelter. It's very, it's necessary to say that I think the whole world saw when lockdown was imposed in India, the whole world saw the pictures of migrant workers. Those very, very heartbreaking, and pictures of migrant workers going back home. In Kerala, migrant workers were part of the public distribution system, and also the public, migrant workers were offered shelter, were given free shelter and accommodation until such time as they went back home. So that was the second, food and basic necessities, shelter. The third was everyone has access to medical care. If you're in Kerala and you fall sick, you know what to do. Every day you're told, there's a telephone number, you do it, and they'll tell you what to do. And the fourth was access to information. We have not only, the best example of this is our Chief Minister every day goes on to, gives a press conference. He meets he meets every question of the press and gives a very detailed report on what the situation with regard to the diseases in Kerala today, the pandemic, and what are the steps the government is taking. So these four formed a very important set of principles: food and basic needs, shelter, medical care, and information, access to information. The next stage is, of course, this is a form of direct benefit transfer. The next stage is how do you rebuild, how do you once again put the production system into, right, as you slowly lift lockdowns, how do you revive the production system? There too, we have tried in the sphere of food production, agriculture, industry, infrastructure, we slowly try to revive construction. We are also the only state in India which still follows a program of 5-year planning. So 5-year plans and annual plans. It was being abolished. It was abolished by this government at the central government at the All India level in 2014. But we have continued with our policy of planning. So the annual plan was reprioritized by the government in order to meet the immediate needs of reviving livelihoods and production in this context. These are some of the, I must say that over this period, the distinctive feature has been the enormous participation of the people in this. And that is in the Kerala's long history of public action. Remember, a very important component part of public action in the Sen framework is civic cooperation. And that is something which we have, we've had a very rich harvest of civic cooperation in Kerala over this period. Let me...
Professor, if I could cut in there for a second, I was wondering, we'd like to talk more about both the civic participation as well as the economy, but first I wanted to ask you about public health infrastructure in Kerala, because the state has both the highest, or at least one of the highest recovery rates in India, as well as one of the lowest mortality rates from the virus. And a lot of experts have said that's due to a pre-existing healthcare infrastructure that's comparatively robust. So could you just tell us a little bit more about that? What does healthcare in Kerala look like compared to the rest of India? And to what extent is that a legacy of perhaps of the left-wing governments of previous generations?
See, Kerala has, we have, there are two parts to our, one is the social determinants of health, education, women's education. This Kerala has been strong in in the development of the different kinds of social determinants of health, sanitation, cleanliness, and so on. But education, with education at the core of this. But now, over the last few years, so the outcome indicators in Kerala of health, life expectancy at birth for men and women, infant mortality rates, they're much, much lower than, life expectancy is much higher, infant mortality is much lower than the rest of India. But in addition, we also have a very comprehensive coverage of primary health centers in the state. You're always within walking, you're more or less within walking distance of primary health center, or a little more than that. Now, the primary health centers over the last 4 years under this present left democratic government, we have used the foundations built by previous left governments in order to try and convert these primary health centers into what we've called family health centers. Now, for basic ailments, there are 2 doctors there. It's open most of the day. So for basic ailments, people go to the family health centers. It's a statewide coverage, okay, throughout the state. Now that and our dedicated health workers have been an enormous, and under a mission which we've begun, it's called the Ardhram mission, the health mission, begun over the last, implemented over the last 4 years. We've had striking success with this conversion. So the mission was to convert primary health centers into family health centers, to create more people-friendly hospital facilities at the district, sub-district levels, and also create a generally better system of health information. So this has really been an enormous asset. Now, and if I may go back to what you were asking a minute ago, I've got the numbers now. The case, this is paid off. Even at this point, with the uptick, the cases per million in Kerala are about 373. In India as a whole, it is 810. This is as on July 27. The case fatality rate in Kerala was 0.34. In India as a whole, it was 2.46. The testing per million is 15,900, almost 16,000 in Kerala. In India, it is 10,179. So the sample positivity rate in Kerala is 2.34. In India as a whole, it is almost 7.96. So it has been, we have, of course, we respect the efforts of other states as well. But this long history of public action, this long history of civic cooperation, of public action from above by left governments in favor of the people, this history of planning has had some benefits for Kerala. Enormous benefits is what I actually mean.
All right, yeah. I was going to say as well, I think the impact might be a little bit larger than you suggest. Well, actually, along those same lines, we also wanted to ask you about the role of Kerala's trade and labor movements during the current pandemic. The Center of Indian Trade Unions, one of the largest trade unions in Kerala, mobilized their members and supporters in helping with disinfecting public spaces, supporting workers, etc. And we were wondering if you could just give a bit more insight into that, and both currently, how are the unions helping in the crisis and the pandemic, but also what is the role of trade unions and the trade union movement in public life in the state?
Now those are 2 separate questions, but let me say that it's the role of mass organizations in Kerala's life is extremely important. It's mass organizations of workers when you deal with workers' issues in industry, mass organizations of peasants and farmers and agricultural workers when you're dealing with the agricultural sector, mass organizations of government workers, mass organizations of, in every sphere of teachers, scientists. They're very important in our day-to-day life in Kerala. It's a part of our lives, the participation. Even in my own organization, for instance, in planning, in the planning board, when we have say we draft the economic plan for 5 years for the state, we first set up working groups in each sector, about 40 working groups, more than 40 working groups, agriculture, industry, fisheries, and so on, traditional industries and so on. Now, in each of these, the trade unions are represented. So they come in to build policy. So, and this is long standing. This whole approach. I think one of the contributions of the left to India's whole political discourse is that you can't actually. If government has to go to the people, you require mass organizations of the working people. Look at the experience of Kerala in land reform, for instance. Look at the experience long ago of West Bengal in land reform. Such land reform could not have been implemented without the active participation of mass organizations of the people. These were not just bureaucratic exercises. Look at the transformation of workers, the conditions of workers' work. These could not have been done without the active participation of the trade unions in our day-to-day life. So this, it's not just handed down. As I was saying, there's this relationship between public action from above and public action from below. We depend on public action from below, and the public is organized into mass organizations. So you can't. That's essential to our political and social functioning in Kerala.
Well, another essential aspect, or you have already mentioned education, that it's at the core of each policy implemented in Kerala. And actually, Kerala has the highest proportion of literate person in the population among other Indian states. Would you say investment in education has played a role in keeping COVID-19 in check among the population? I mean, especially when it comes to stigma connected to COVID-19 and all of that.
I think it's not sort of just a sort of automatic or direct. It has huge implications. The spread of education in our society. It's not, by the way, it is not only literacy. It's also retention, school retention, and the proportion of children who go up to 12th class. It's even among the most educationally deprived sections in Kerala do better than the most educationally privileged sections in other parts of the country. For instance, in rural Kerala. So there is a pervasive atmosphere of the need and the necessity for education. People read, people follow the papers. This is well known in Kerala. People follow the newspapers every morning. All sections of the working people know what happened yesterday. With regard to they know what the instructions are locally. So the ability, I told you that, I mentioned earlier that we have this one big aspect of our campaign with respect to the pandemic has been to offer information to the public, keeping the public informed. Education is key to that information, to that spread of information. And I must say, with regard to school education, if you mind, if I may just take a second, this government, the present left-front government, see in India as a whole, I believe that's a problem in many parts of the world. There's a shift to the private sector under the impact of neoliberal policies. There's been a shift to the private sector and school education. Kerala is the only state in India where, over the last 4 years, there's been a shift of children. Hundreds of thousands of children has shifted from the private to the public sector of school education because of the upgrading of school facilities in the last 4 years, both teaching quality and actual physical infrastructure in schools. So this has played a big. So an atmosphere of education is one in which it's possible, and also not only that, it's not only education, but it's also the attempt. Remember, it's a left government. So it's a government which encourages the spread of the scientific temper, of scientific knowledge, of an abhorrence of superstition, of saying that this is the way, this is superstition, this is not scientifically proved, this is proved, this is what is now approved internationally. These are the medical norms now in place. It's of course much more feasible to implement a campaign like that where education is school education is universal. Yeah.
Professor Ramachandram, we wanted to ask you, we wanted to zoom out a little bit more and talk a bit more about the broader history of the left in your state. Obviously, the communist movement, the socialist movement, the left in India historically has been quite strong, but especially in the last 10, 15 years, in general, the politics of the country have taken a pretty sharp rightward turn, obviously embodied by the current Prime Minister Modi and his BJP party, but also I think significantly from a left perspective is the fall of the left in West Bengal, the other Indian state that's traditionally or often at least been under left-wing rule. So could you tell us a bit now in 2020, what is it about Kerala that makes Kerala unique? Why is the left hung on in your state? And maybe just give us a bit more information about the history of the left in your state. What makes it so integral to political life in Kerala?
The interesting question, very big question, and not easy to answer in a few minutes. I've written on this, and I'm happy to on a history of the history of Kerala's human development achievements, and I'm happy to send that to you sometime, Lauren. But let's put it this way: in Kerala, see, the left brought together or took the leadership of many strands of social movements. If you look at the history of let's at least go back into the 20th century, late 19th and 20th century. The left in Kerala brought under its banner, under its flag, it brought together the movement against colonialism, against the colonial rule. That is the national movement, the independence movement. The movement against landlordism and rural oppression. It brought under its banner the movement for social reform, for social change, against caste oppression, against the crime of untouchability. So these movements, which had developed as part of Kerala's history, the movement against untouchability, against for social reform, the movement for education, the movement for land reform and against landlordism and the oppressive pre-capitalist structures that existed in our countryside, and the movement against the British colonial power, were actually brought together under the banner of the left. And that is our historical legacy. That's an enormous, and that's our rich heritage. Now, with this, Kerala consisted of three component parts historically before independence. One was the Kingdom of Travancore, which is the south. The central part of Kerala was the Kingdom of Cochin, and the northern part of Kerala was the district of Malabar, which was under the British, part of British India. So there were two princely states and one British Indian component, which merged together into the linguistic state of Kerala at the time after independence. The first elections to the unified state of Kerala were held in 1957. Now, with this enormous legacy, this historical legacy of the agrarian movement, of the national movement, of the social movement, the first government to come to power was the first party to come to government was the Communist Party in 1957. So in the first election to Kerala held in 1957, within 6 days, 5 or 6 days of its coming into power, it passed the land reform law. Before it was toppled finally by a conspiracy from of reaction, but never the government was toppled. But having said that, right from the beginning, health, education, and land reform were priorities. And again, health, land reform, and health, education, and land reform. This combination supported solidly from below by mass. You asked earlier, what was the role of the mass organizations of people? Mass organization of agricultural workers, of farmers and peasants, and of the workers themselves in different traditional and the small sectors of modern industry that existed at that time. So that mass base, that sort of sweeping public participation, that combination of action from above and below has been the mainstay of Kerala's. Slowly, as we developed, Kerala also had, now this also produced a workforce that was literate, politically conscious, and educated, skilled. This workforce made a name for itself. They began to earn incomes in different parts of the world. These incomes, now earlier Kerala was known as high human development and low income. But by the 90s, Kerala also had not only the highest human development indicators in Kerala, in India, but also the highest was beginning to emerge as the highest in terms of consumer expenditure. So this basis, and I think refusal of the left to rest on its laurels in Kerala, you always have to, this public debate, adversarial action, public debate is so live in Kerala. And I think that as a result of all this, a lot of the program of the left became part of the public consensus. It's very difficult to reverse land reform or to persuade people in Kerala that that school education is not necessary, or that to persuade people in Kerala that we should go back on our food distribution system, and so on. See? Mm-hmm. So that's some of our program has become part of the public discourse, embedded in the public discourse. I think this is some of the, it is a partial explanation for what you asked. Is
absolutely.
That
Absolutely. We're sort of staying on that theme, or rather maybe Kerala's successes in distinction to the rest of the country. So Kerala also has a highly diverse population in terms of religions being practiced, with a Hindu majority, but nevertheless large Christian and Muslim majorities. And I wanted to get your perspective on what's going on right now, well, actually literally today, in the city of Ayodhya in Uttar Pradesh. So Prime Minister Modi, speaking at the site of the Babri Masjid, a 16th century mosque that was demolished in 1992 and is now going to be the site for a Hindu temple to Lord Ram. He spoke at a ceremony this morning and described the construction of this site as an act that will help to unite the nation, quote unquote, in these trying times. Obviously, this is a very divisive move on his part, but how do you evaluate what's going on right now in Indian national politics, and what kind of implications do you think the move like this could have for the future?
I say that first let's be in Kerala for a minute. In Kerala, you're right, we have a very substantial, about 40% of the population is non-Hindu. And in Kerala, this is a very important part of our the history of our participation of the left leadership of the national movement was it's secular commitment. It's commitment to its commitment to secular politics. And that in Kerala, it's very, very important that the people of different religious communities and people who have no religion, people who have no religion, living together and working together. This is again a given in our day-to-day life in Kerala. It's very important. The unity and tolerance in day-to-day life is and secularism, not only in the sense of tolerance, but also secularism in the sense of the state, the activity of the state being independent of religion. So this is it's been it's crucial to the success of the left. It's a crucial part of the left program in Kerala. Now, as you know, in the last few decades, but it's reached a high pitch after 2014. The politics of Hindutva in India has come to occupy the center stage of national politics. And now, what does Hindutva mean? Hindutva means the use of Hinduism. Now, please, we should distinguish between the religion of Hinduism, which many people practice, and the political ideology of Hindutva. These are two different things. The political ideology of Hindutva means the use of Hinduism as a political mobilization strategy. So in my view, as a person of the left in India, the fundamental fact about Hindutva is that it disunites. So to say that anything that glorifies Hindutva is a unifying event or a unifying act flies in the face of reality, because the whole point of using religion as a political mobilization strategy is to assert separateness, right? Mm-hmm. And to do that, and for the religious majority to use religion as a political mobilization strategy is most dangerous for unity. So it is. I was when this happened in '91. I was in Mumbai, teaching in the city of Mumbai. It was horrendous. It was horrendous to see the mosque come down, to see the sort of violence that followed. Profoundly disunifying acts of violence against the Muslim minority in Mumbai at the time. So it's a particularly, I think, the politics of using Hinduism to disunify is a particularly abhorrent part of our polity, in my view.
It's very interesting speaking of the use of Hinduism, but I'd like to...
As a political mobilization strategy.
Yes.
I mean, those who want to practice the religion, that's
exactly. Exactly. But I'd like to go to another aspect of the crisis right now, a very interesting one. Like Kerala is a home for a migrant community, has a large population of migrant community from other Indian states. And very interesting, according to available information, less than 10% of the migrant community in Kerala expressed their desire to go back to their home state. So they prefer to stay in Kerala. They feel at home in Kerala. What makes Kerala a migrant-friendly state, and how did the government tackle the migrant crisis in Kerala?
There are, one thing is that you see, after the change in the levels of consumer expenditure, etc., after 90s, Kerala has had, in all sectors, construction, industry, agriculture, road building, infrastructure, we've had a very large migrant labor force. Now, the course, India as a whole has a huge, what is called circular migration. People who come from their village go to, whether it's Delhi or Bombay or Mumbai or different parts all over this Tamil Nadu, Bangalore, and then they go back for a few months a year to their villages, sometimes to cultivate, sometimes to just to be with their families, of course. But some of them also have organic agricultural links with their villages. Now, Kerala is, there are some things which, especially in Kerala, I guess, the wages are higher. So the wages are better because of the part played by, we come once again to Lauren's question on workers' organizations. The wages are higher. Basically, you get higher wages. And if you speak to migrant workers, you'll also be told that you can be sure you'll get your wage. There's going to be no, there's no deception about this. Or, once you work, you get the wage. It's even if you're working as a casual worker on a daily wage basis, you can be sure that the employer will pay your wage. And if not, there'll be redressal. There are places to stay. That's not always given. That's maybe hired. It may be rented. It may be some places there are hostels indeed, provided by the Labour Department. But you get a certain degree of protection from the Labour Department of the government itself. And you get a higher wage. You get a degree of protection. You also there are literacy programs available. There's some of them actually bring their children and get educated. They go to school in Kerala. So altogether, Kerala's got this term. It's different from what you have in Germany. It's not equivalent to that, but calling workers guests. It's not the guest worker of Germany, but it's the idea of the workers of the workers of other states being guests in our state. Now, in fact, I've got a lot of things. There are safer shelters when they find themselves in congested places over this period. Number one. Number two, several factory owners themselves have taken steps to provide workers with safe accommodation. Government assured that they would be supplied free food through social kitchens, and they would not starve for want of food or water. That is in that first phase. Then workers with mild symptoms were given quarantine support. Then many people were those who were stranded in railway stations were brought back and given accommodation. Then the material conditions and the labor commissioners took care of the camps where they were living. I can go on. I've got a list of policy measures that were taken.
Actually, yeah. Professor, we're almost out of time, but I wanted to ask one more question because it's an important one. Obviously, the coronavirus and the corona crisis, as people like to call it, has the physical health aspects, the social aspects, and as well as what will probably the most long-term and most destructive, the economic aspects. I wanted to ask you, as you sit on Kerala State Planning Board, which I understand is currently preparing or has prepared a report on the economic fallout of the coronavirus in Kerala. Could you tell us a little bit about the board's findings and what measures the state has taken and will continue to take to address the economic impact?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Now, I'll try and answer this quickly, but may I say, this links up to one of your previous questions on Hindutva, etc. See, we have, and economic policy and things like that. One thing about Kerala is, we believe that we are one place which is still, despite all the problems of our constitutional arrangements in India, the states have a lot of duties, but they don't always have the means for financing those duties. Under our constitution, we are responsible for agriculture, education, higher education, school education, industry, and a whole host of the basic tasks of nation building, development tasks of nation building are with the states. We don't, however, have the wherewithal, the resources to meet all those obligations. That's our constitutional arrangement. That's a larger question. But given those constraints, Kerala is attempting to implement an alternative, non-neoliberal path of development. And in that sense, we are different, not only from the BJP, but also from previous Congress governments. We are now, in that respect, what we first did was we tried to assess the losses, and the losses were particular. How much time? I find you 2 minutes? How much time?
Yeah, we have a couple of minutes. Go ahead.
We see, without going to the detail, which is available on our website, by the way, if you want it, let me say that the immediate impact was on agriculture and related activity sectors like animal resources, fisheries, and so on industry, on tourism, which is very important for Kerala, which came to a halt, on the labor sector as a whole, for women. These were the areas. These were the main areas. Even on remittances. So there was a multi-pronged impact. Many of the areas which provide us the most came to a halt because of the pandemic and the subsequent lockdown. Now, this one by one we first announced for 20,000 crore. The term crore in India means 10 million. So 20,000 means 200 million. 200 million, 200,000 million, 200,000 million, 20,000 crore package for revival. That was our first announcement. After that, what we did was we started implementing we reprioritized, as I said, the plan. And we started putting money into, we first announced a very ambitious program in food production, food and agricultural production, which involved bringing new land, fallow land under the plow in the case of rice, fruit, vegetable production, and production of our export-oriented plantation crops. So that is a very ambitious program. It also involved new investment and expenditure in animal resources and fisheries. So this was the first part. Secondly, we announced a new program for what we call MSMEs, micro, small, medium enterprises, because these two are very badly hit by the pandemic and subsequent lockdown. And Kerala, being a state which has a very large sector of traditional industries, things like coconut fiber, coir, cashew, handlooms, and so on, it was very badly affected. So the MSME sector was the next. So one by one, we are trying to revive production and so each sector or each department of government has reprioritized their expenditure in such a way as to try and bridge the gap in livelihoods as early as possible. That has been the basic planning alternative. This is available to us because we still have a planning structure in the state. So,
thanks so much for your time. That's all the discussion we can have today. I want to thank Professor Ramachandran so much for his insightful, informative commentary, especially in times where the left has tended to lose elections and lose battles. It's really refreshing to hear that there are still a few places in the world where the left is in power and can make a difference and still can even enact 5-year plans. My name is Lauren Balhorn, and with me, as always, was Fida Al-Zanin. Our guest this week was Professor V.K. Ramachandram of the Left Democratic Front in Kerala. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at Rosa-Lux_Global. Feel free to leave us suggestions for future topics or guests here on Facebook or on Twitter under the hashtag Global Solidarity. We'll be back in 2 weeks again on the 19th of August at 3 p.m. Central European Time. That's all for now. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you. As always, at the end of such a discussion, you think about all that you've left